So what I'm going to do is I'm going to circulate around the room. If you guys have questions, please write them down on the pieces of paper that hopefully you have, so that I can share them with the panelists. But before that, I have the privilege of asking the first question. So the thing I would like to know is, so I am reminded, I think, about the Arab Spring. Of course, that's something that has really come up as we think about these new street protests that we're seeing across the region, and how it seems to me that the protesters themselves are also very aware of the Arab Spring. And they're aware of how the Arab Spring ended, which was not very well for their various political campaigns. So I think I would like you to help us sort of understand how these demonstrations are being organized differently, how they're being articulated differently, and what their goals are in comparison to that earlier set of goals. And maybe we can start with Ron and go down the line.
Oh, I don't know anything about those protests, but I'll tell you something. I had a conversation with a person, I'm not going to give you his name, but many of you would know it. He said to me, the next street protests are going to be in Saudi Arabia. He said the tension in Saudi Arabia among young people is so great, it's just ready to explode. Something will set it off. You can look forward to that. I think you, was it Mao who said, when the grass is green, a small spark can start a prairie fire? When there's so much tension, something can start it off. And it's impossible for us sitting here, or even people who are far more knowledgeable than I am, to say what that spark will be. But something will set it off because the conditions of tension are so great. So that's my thought.
I think, yeah, I agree with Sally that the events of Tahrir and the kind of aftermath of that, Syria, Libya, that's still very much in the minds of people in the Middle East or in the Arab world. But I think the demands are still very similar to what they were there. Basically, it was end corruption, provide end corruption and political corruption, provide a decent, provide job opportunities for people, improve the economy. They're not, more franchise, more, democracy, participation in government and politics. They're not very different, the demands. But I think, I think there's a little more savviness in the way that they're organizing. I think, for instance, what was happening in Beirut was very hopeful, and that it was very much anti-sectarian. And once it sort of would turn a little bit sectarian, they would kind of, stop and regroup and try to remind themselves of the purpose of the revolt. It was to end the sort of sectarian divides and really create a political system that's based on citizenship and not on one sect. But I don't know, to be honest, I don't know how hopeful I am, only because the only country where there was a revolution and it was successful was Tunis. And the reason it was successful is because it had a viable and healthy civil society, and a long-standing one. They had very strong unions in Tunis. They had a strong education system. There were certain things in place that allowed Tunisia to come out of that period of chaos and to sort of move ahead. I think it's doing a pretty good job. I don't know if that exists in other Arab countries. We can revolt, but is there sort of, are there institutions in place like there was in Tunis to uphold the change? Not to mean that, I'm not saying that there shouldn't be protests or anything, but I don't know how it's going to move forward with the absence of certain institutions to allow people to become democratic, to vote, to have people transition in and out of power and what have you. So yeah.
I could talk about Lebanon. I mean, the unique thing about Lebanon, those demonstrations are not like against repressive rules. Actually, it's like Syria, for example. It started in Syria in 2011. In Lebanon, it's basically about the government corruption. I mean, about really on an everyday basis, people are fed up. There are no services. electricity for 30 years. You know, they don't have electricity, so like we have to buy electricity beside, you know, so we have like 2 bills, say, problem with picking up the garbage, as simple as that, it's not done, among other things. The new thing in Lebanon that, historically speaking, there has been political parties like leftist and liberal, Al-Almaniyun. They've been talking about separating church from state, to put in American terminology. But for the first time, this call is coming today from the street. And there's this total identification between sectarian politics and corruption. So that's why when they say kullun yani kullun, like all of them means all of them, that's what it really means, that they mean all corrupt, and we don't want any sectarian politics anymore. Not because that religious institutions in Lebanon are repressive, maybe they are a little bit, but because the corruption now has a sectarian tool. Okay? And that's, I think, the new element, and this is the challenge. How we're going to do this, because institutions are sectarian at all levels. So that's basically the big risk and hope and challenge at the same time.
In all the countries we've talked about, a couple of things have been happening. Big picture things have been happening. Populations are growing, they're younger, they're more urbanized, they're more educated. All those things are true, and all those things put demands on the government to produce improvements. People expect if they go to college, they're not going to be cab drivers afterwards, for example. A lot of engineering cab drivers in town. And beyond that, there's also an awareness and sophistication, not just about their own countries and their own history and their own recent past, but what else is going on in the world. You saw in some of the art, the way they were sort of bringing in some European and other symbols to kind of, there's a sense that things can be better, that and that the current political structures just aren't intent on delivering it. And so what was striking me about the Arab Spring, and also about the different but close in time, the Green Movement protests, is that in the initial phases there's this strange, I wasn't sure in the moment if it was an attempt to cynically appropriate the kind of ideological positions of the state by making reference in the Iranian case to sort of the martyrs of the Iran-Iraq War, the martyrs of the revolution, and the kind of the stories about how that revolution overthrew a tyrant, to sort of remind the current leadership in Iran where they're supposed to have come from in terms of the idealism of their revolution, how it's supposed to apply to them. Because in all the Arab countries too, you have a number of different important dates in July from different regime changes where things were supposed to make it, whether it was the Ba'athist change here or there are these, or in Egypt, for example, with all of that, the free officers. Something was supposed to come with that, and there'll be generations of folks who thought that to an extent it might have begun. And so on the one hand, there's this notion that things could be better because there have been moments in time when they've been better, and that it requires, though, the inclusion of, let's say, all the people and all the civic institutions. So, and then you have these repressive crackdowns. So even though the protesters are initially not necessarily violent, and invoking like idealism and civic stuff, and it gets cracked down, the question for me is how much more cynical it's become or not. And what sort of impressed me or moved me, I guess, is if you saw that student statement, it's not a cynical statement at all. It's utterly realistic, but it's also got high expectations for what Iran's supposed to be able to do. And I suspect that's true in all the countries we're talking about. So I think what fuels it is this fact, well, there's not much else they can do. These pressures that Said was talking about on the region, those are shaping things. A lot of the protests in Syria, there was one study that talked about some of the regional protests, the provincial protests, were at least aggravated by the fact that there was more difficult environmental conditions in those provincial areas, and the state wasn't responding. Like in Iran, there's often complaints about water distribution, for example. So, sorry, I went over answering your question.
Well, that's okay. I mean,
Yeah.
ecologists, just to come back to this, ecologists are saying that really all of this can be attributed in part to global warming and the fact that it's changing the water distribution, agriculture, driving more people off the land. I mean, where is global warming going to affect people first? In the hottest places and in the wettest places. And that's basically what we're seeing here.
Migration patterns as well. You asked the question about what is the legacy of the Arab Spring. I mean, so much has been assessed, as you said, that people have paid attention to this in the region. They've looked beyond their own countries to try to assess it. And I think the point that you made about Tunisia is so very important. You have a civil society which had the kind of space and the apparatus to deal with this. But I think there's also another aspect. I mean, protests are nothing new in the region. They're nothing new in the world. But it has to do with agency. And perhaps the best way to delegitimize any kind of movement is for people to suspect as though the strings are being pulled from outside. So when it comes to Libya, at least until now, it was a movement after post-Gaddafi which was seen as organically developing from within to a certain degree. Now with Khalid Haftar and who's pulling the strings on that is taking it into a different orbit. Bahrain was seen as a movement which was then suppressed from the outside. Saudi Arabia drawing tanks across the causeway, treating Bahrain as just like the Florida Keys, just something offshore. Egypt, there was the Pride of Tahrir because it was a movement that the Egyptians had from within, but the disillusionment of 2013 being from external forces, primarily from the Gulf, to scupper what was still an inchoate regime of Mohamed Morsi. Which leads us to Iran. 1892, the tobacco protest was something from within. The constitutional movement up to 1905, 1906 was from within. There's also the scars of 1953, where the coup d'etat was imposed from outside. 2009 was seen as protest from within without being gamed. And right now, the 2019 disturbances and the protests are maintaining the sanctity in the public that it is something from inside. If it is ever thought that there are the hidden or not so hidden hands of external forces, it's difficult to see how that's going to then maintain the legitimacy of this coming from within. But one point I think that's important to see where the trajectory is going is I think it's very telling that in the investigation of the Ukrainian jet downing, who has been selected or appointed to lead the investigation, and this is Ibrahim Raisi, who many are now considering to be Khamenei's successor. And I don't know how much of the protests or how much of the street is really responding to this, because he is seen as at least as hardline as Khamenei, and perhaps maybe even more so. So stay tuned to see how this then is going to affect the narrative of the protest movement in Iran.
So I want to remind people, if you have questions, please pass them down so I can read them to the participants. So rather than do one question and have you guys respond, I'm going to read the 4 questions I have, because you're going to see they are very, very diverse in orientation. And you guys, so the first one is directed toward Dr. Dika. Will the cross-sectarian Lebanese revolution currently happening be powerful enough to take on the strong political, ideological affiliations people hold in the country? And so I think we've already addressed that to a certain extent, but perhaps there's a little bit more to be said here. Another asks, as experts in Middle Eastern culture and history, can you speak to the potential effects of what we can expect as a result of our president's actions? And there's a lot of material there for you to discuss. A third one, why did America decide to become entangled in the Arab-Israeli conflict? I don't really see a specific reason or motive. It isn't just oil or gas. That's one question. And again, all of these questions, we want to see you in our classrooms. Anyway, so the fourth one says, what will the future of the Gulf states be as the world transitions away from oil and natural gas? So these are really, really different questions. So
if I can, that very last one about why is the U.S. involved, particularly one of the things to recognize about the U.S.'s role in the region is that, to some extent, our early presence in the Middle East is missionary, in early 19th century. Because the big Western players in the Middle East, whether it's France or whether it's Great Britain, they were the ones in charge. In fact, American consulates were usually trying to work on trade and protect missionaries. They really weren't engaging in sort of the geopolitical stuff. That begins to change, though, really with World War I. And that's when you begin to see the U.S. getting much more involved initially to try to interrupt some of the colonial ambitions of the French and the British. But ultimately, what happens after World War II is as the British and the French retreat from their various stations around the world, the U.S. steps into their script. How, that's the sort of big reason why we get involved. There are other reasons. There's you could talk about the influence of the Zionist movement outside in Europe and in the U.S., but that doesn't really have an impact until later. But you also have a group called sort of is it Restorationists, late 19th century Christians who are interested in the same sort of it predates slightly, but that is sort of the same time as the rise of Zionism and European Jewish sort of returns to Palestine, which began before World War I. That's the other thing I kind of want to underscore is the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is pre-World War I. It's accelerated in certain ways by World War I, but it's pre-World War I. Our involvement begins kind of where French and British involvement begins to end. But it's to simplify it tremendously.
Okay, about Lebanon, well, that's a $1 million question about the chance of success for the non-sectarian. But it is, as I mentioned earlier, this time it is raised on the ground. Like before, it was raised by elitists, like secularists, like the Hizb al-Qawm Suri or the Communist Party in Lebanon, but they were like on the margin of. But seriously, no one before raised the issue of eliminating the sectarian political quota system until now. So with this kind of passion, but again, those groups are marginal. Okay, some of them are like from the left. Some of them are like secularist, new young generation. But politically speaking, until now they have not generated real movements. I mean, the potential is there. Why? Because the sectarian system has really consumed itself. I mean, by now. I mean, they exist because they are there, because they control the institutions, the police, okay. But they spent their energy, if you like. Okay? So, well, that's an open question. The potential is there. Well, it depends on how the new movement will be able to generate energy and organization to put pressure on the existing regime. Okay, like by starting changing the electoral system, okay, which is now sectarian. I mean, all the parliament and everything else is distributed based on the sect. So this is the first step. Now it's raised in the street, okay, but the potential again is going to be uphill struggle.
Just the thing to watch, I think, in all these countries is where the political elites wind up on things, and particularly certain institutions, especially the military. I mean, all during the Arab Spring, especially, my question was, so where's the military on this? And as if you look at how things unfolded, they were crucial. Looking who's in that because they're the most well-resourced. They're the biggest patronage system in any one of these countries is the military.
Well, in Lebanon, the military is multi-headed, so there's no danger of
In
military
Lebanon,
rule.
it's a little different, but in
Yeah,
Egypt, it's
but
not
in
just-
Egypt, it's
they-
different story.
They own everything. I mean,
Right.
they own the society, and so.
It's like and these notion of a sort of a state state-managed economy with sort of private private-public partnerships, and really what they are is that there are these state corporations that, if you want to have a business, you kind of have to work within a sort of state system. It's a bit like the PLA in China, or I mean that's true in Iran, and so that's another reason why a lot of popular protest is against government actors and elites, because it's hard to get in on that system. They know that the government controls the opportunities, not
It's
just.
become more or less like a caste system, economically.
Or just a closed system, like
Yeah.
here in the United States, these two political parties now have so
Love them.
divided that
Yeah.
you can't operate outside of that system. And that system doesn't seem to be serving the interests of the people anymore. So, I mean, in my opinion, but anyway, I'm not one of the panelists. So do the rest of you have things to add?
What were the 4 questions again?
So there was one about the future of the Gulf states. As this was an optimistic one, as the world transitions away from oil and gas. I mean, only optimistic because we wish that were happening faster. The Lebanese one, I think, was answered. The potential effects of the current president's policies in the region, and the question about American involvement, I think Cam answered. So.
Okay. As far as the one regarding the Gulf states, and I think you framed it as a reduced role in natural gas and oil, I'm not sure if that's really happening. It seems as though the center of gravity may be shifting, but natural gas and oil are still going to play very big roles. In fact, right now, there is the issue of natural gas in the Eastern Mediterranean, and who is making an effort to try to mine that. We find that particularly Israel is interested in deep water exploration, and the fact that there is a proposed pipeline that involves Israel, Cyprus, and Greece, which would then circumvent the need for Russia and Turkey's pipelines into Europe by having the benefit of an EU country, Greece, and Cyprus being present in that capacity. That can cause a paradigm shift in the region, particularly when it comes to Israel's involvement in a natural resource like natural gas. So this is not over, and then of course the extremely large cache of oil that has been discovered in Iran. So I'm not sure that I could respectfully accept the premise that the region is having a diminution in its significance regarding oil. And as I said before, given the Belt and Road Initiative, given Iran's central location within that and Chinese designs, some reports are actually even framing it as saying that Iran is going to be China's gas station and way station as it is creating a BRI going east and west and back and forward. So yeah, as far as I think the Gulf states, they probably were really hoping that there was going to be more of an intensification in the relationship with Iran. They were certainly successful in that compared to how the American posture was under Obama, one of diplomatic engagement. And of course, we know now that the JCPOA is completely shattered, and the consequences from that. But I think it's also important to recognize that underneath, there's a subterfuge of failures when it comes to the Gulf states in being able to capitalize and exploit American deference to some of their actions. And you see this particularly in the case of Yemen. This has been a complete catastrophe for Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. The UAE has already withdrawn much of its full support and military support in the region rather surreptitiously. The Saudis have also brokered a loose ceasefire with Yemen, and again, doing so under the cloak and veneer of secrecy because they realize that it's a face-saving imperative that calls for it. But you won't hear these things discussed ever on the street in Riyadh or in Jeddah or in Dubai or in Abu Dhabi.
Let me talk about our president. Not really about our president. We're status quo power. We're the dominant power in the world. That's changing, but for the time being, we're the tops. A country should focus on its own interests. This is a school of international studies, international relations called the Realist School. You focus on what is your own interests. So what interests do we have? First is maintaining the status quo. Anybody that's disrupting something, we should be against it. We should go the other direction and say, no, you can't disrupt this. No, we're not going to allow that. Our goal should be to stabilize the region. That's a very critical region because of a whole host of things, one of which, of course, is oil. You have so much oil in that region. And we live on look at this. You see this? Made out of oil. You see this? Oil. I mean, oil. It's everywhere. We're having our status quo disrupted. We're having our influence disrupted by, I think the Israeli lobby is disrupting our influence. Who do we send to negotiate a peace settlement between the Israelis and Palestinians? Two people who are connected to the settler movement. I mean, it's amazing. Our chief negotiator was someone who said Jews who criticize the settlers are capos. I mean, these are Nazis. He called them Nazis, basically. What did I mean? This is the person we trusted. So we've got a really bad situation. And I'm just carrying with me. Look what I have here. Oh my gosh, this is the deal of the century. I tell you. If Jared can't do it, who can? Well, Jared can't do it. I've been reading. I just read the first 40 pages, and I had a nice long interview with the Jewish News this morning. But I read this. These are basically Bibi talking points. These are the arguments that Bibi Netanyahu makes. I mean, some of the things, it's hard to believe that he didn't write it. I mean, maybe he did. I don't know. Raising issues that nobody's raising just because, like, the Palestinians have to change their textbooks. The Palestinians have to completely dismantle Hamas and create a peaceful situation in Gaza. And until that's done, the Israelis are not obligated to do anything. Okay? Who wrote that? I don't know. But I'm thinking to myself, we should be trying to stabilize the situation. The purpose of an Israeli-Palestinian negotiation process should not be to bring justice to the Palestinians. The Palestinians will never get justice. The Palestinians, the goal should be to prevent the next war. That should be our goal, to prevent the next war. This is basically incitement to the next war. That's what this is. And so, what is our president's role? Catastrophic.
Yeah, and you talked about Israel-Palestine. You didn't talk about Iran, or Iraq, or Syria. All
Well,
these
I
other
think we
places
just
where-
got a string of things, don't
Yeah,
we?
yeah.
But look, we saw Putin coming in. Right now, Assad would be in exile if it hadn't been for Putin. Okay, what should our position be on that? We're trying to not destabilize the situation. We're in a really bad situation. I don't see a solution to many of these problems, but I think our president is the least person you would want to be in charge of a really, really bad situation.
Yeah. I have a few questions, but before that, yeah.
I mean, clearly Trump is sort of an extremist in many ways, but I don't think the deal that's presented is very much a deviation from American foreign policy towards the Palestinians.
This deal?
It's not, no. I mean, there's never been, America is a sort of, never been an honest broker. The U.S. policy has never been like, let's get justice for the Palestinians. I mean, this is sort of, again, maybe it's the usual U.S. administration stance on steroids, but it's not really that much. I mean, I'm not surprised by what has come out. I'm not shocked by it. So, I mean, whether it's Trump or somebody else, I mean, Obama wasn't very good on Arab-Israel. Clinton wasn't, Bush was. I mean, it's just more of the same, just sort of taken to a more intense degree.
I was going through, as I was reading this, and I read it quickly. I was making checks on where these are basically abandonments of longstanding U.S. positions. Number one, annex the West Bank. Okay, that's no American president has ever taken anything close to that.
No American president has really tried to stop the settlements. I mean, the settlements are an annexation of the West Bank. They're facts on the ground. You're not going to dismantle. I mean, every settlement that's built is one step closer to annexation of the West Bank.
Secondly, 194, which says that the solution is to return Palestinians return or be compensated. Obviously, they're not going to return to Israel, but they could return to a Palestinian state. This says they can't return to a Palestinian state unless the Israelis clear each and every one of them. And if they come from places where there's anti-Israeli sentiment, they mention Lebanon and they mention Syria, those are sort of no-nos. This is totally different from anything any American president has ever said. So there's a whole series of things, the annexation of the Golan province, breaking the international consensus. These are all really deviations. We could debate this, but I think this president has taken positions which are dramatically different from any position ever taken by any American president.
And I think actually that was part of his campaign promise. So, so I have a few other questions, and I'm aware of the clock. We technically have 10 more minutes. So, but these take us in very different directions. So one person wants to know the role Turkey will play as Assad consolidates his power. Will Turkey and Syria allow a Kurdish-dominated state to remain north of the Euphrates? So that's one question. What role do Turkey and Pakistan play in contemporary Middle Eastern issues? What caused the Saudi-Yemeni war? How has Oman remained neutral and isolationist in such a volatile region? I don't know if you want to take these.
Well,
10 minutes.
I feel like I want to get a lifeline over to Ara on the Turkey question, because your research area was
I don't know.
Turkey.
I would have to talk more about Lebanon, but my short answer is the Kurds are unfortunately a weak people. They were denied what they could have easily achieved in 1920, and it will need a global shift for them to have a state of their own. It will not be any worse than any other Arab state. I think they will be able to manage it as much as the Arabs have managed their own states. I have no doubt about that. But the balance of power is so much against them that I really don't see that happening under any circumstances. So whoever is in Damascus, whoever is in Ankara, I think is even secondary to the joint desire not to have it.
In terms of the Oman survival question, part of that is a little bit of the stance Oman has taken with respect to other neighbors. Part of that is there is Oman was sort of contested territory for some time, with different governments vying to control its monarchy. The Iranian government in the 70s, sort of stabilizing that government against a largely leftist, not 100% clear. And then so also its religious bent is not that of Sunni or Shia, so there's a little bit of an exceptionalism to Oman. Plus, historically, that area has been outward-looking in maritime power. So there's a bunch of things that sort of historically, circumstantially give Oman this kind of breathing room. Where they're not obviously in a sectarian camp, they're not obviously in a sort of regional alignment. When we want to talk to Iran, we talk through Oman or Pakistan to Iran. Often is the case. So I think that's one of the reasons. I mean, but that it's been something of an exception. Where it's not an exception, unfortunately, is this sort of your choice of powerful state with a king, powerful state with a dictator, powerful state with a supreme leader. These are a lot of your options. And Oman, we shouldn't kid ourselves, Oman is not different in that sense from a lot of countries. Whatever latitude is given to people to express themselves, there are red lines that Omani citizens have to observe, just like there were for Iranians and for other folks. I think in Lebanon you have decentralized red lines, but there's red lines all over the place.
Local.
Local, right. So, and in that sense, it's not totally exceptional in that sense, but.
So I think that's a nice segue to talk about Turkey and Pakistan.
Mm-hmm.
It's important to remember that these are two countries that were both member states in a bygone defense pact known as the Central Nations Treaty Organization, which was basically NATO East.
Iran dropped out. We're sorry.
I'm sorry?
Iran dropped out. We're sorry.
Yeah, I think Iraq did too. Actually, it was also named the Baghdad Pact, and caused Nasser to blow a gasket, which then made him get on all Arab radio and openly call for the ouster of the king and also Nouri al-Said, the Anglophile prime minister. Turkey and Pakistan have historically had very close relations, irrespective of whether they were Kemalists or Islamists in the case of Erdogan, and irrespective of whether they were democracies or dictatorships in Pakistan. And Pakistan has always played this role of a pivot point. As you said, I mean, has served as a liaison. The Iranian mission in Washington is actually in the embassy of Pakistan. Pakistan in the early 1970s was the conduit between the Nixon administration and Mao Zedong. It was Yahya Khan who, in fact, delivered the communique, which then, quote unquote, opened China to the United States and to the West. And although the United States has really shifted its major priority in the area toward India, which has a far larger market and much more potential for trade and other kind of commercial interaction, Pakistan cannot be ignored. It is considered to be right now, I think, the possessor of the fourth largest nuclear arsenal on the planet. That's no small potatoes. And despite Saudi Arabia's claim that Pakistan is simply its off-site facility for its nuclear weapons, I don't think that the Pakistani intelligence community or the military feels that way. And again, given China's relationship with Pakistan, a $46 billion investment in Pakistani infrastructure, including the port at Gwadar, it's going to play an instrumental role, as will Iran, connecting into Turkey as well. So I think we're going to see that both of these countries, in whatever capacity they can, we also have to understand that these are asymmetric regarding what Turkey's economy is, what Pakistan's economy and capabilities are. But as we see in some of these situations, stability and economic power aren't the only two factors and variables in being influential.
With all these countries that we're talking about, Turkey would be included, but there's also this, Iran definitely is in this box, and I think it sounds like it's an issue in Lebanon. And even if you think about Israel, the Palestinians, the notion of sort of fundamental economic inequality sort of all throughout the region, just like that's a complaint here in the States, that's a complaint there too. And that's where these sort of global forces, sort of where the rubber meets the road. Because there's a sense of being both close to opportunities that are global. If you're in a place like Iran, South Korean tourists, yay! Chinese investment, hurrah! But also the sense that those powers, like the West before it or currently, have an outsized influence. And then on top of that, their own local government, whether it's Erdogan's Turkey or Khamenei's Islamic Republic, or any of these governments, that they're presiding over a kind of collaboration with global capital that they're going to profit from at the expense of everybody else. And so there is, when our politicians complain about jobs to China, there's a version of that discussion in almost every country. In Iran, all our water is being sent to Kuwait, somehow, magically. That's the complaint people will say. All of those Zayandewood is being exported to Kuwait. Of course, but it's a paranoid thing, but that's the sense of a weird kind of regional zero sum that's based fundamentally in a sense of unequal access to even natural resources now. We talk about oil. One thing you can't do with oil is drink it, and that's in that region that's a big issue with growing populations. Even when you talk about some of the solutions to energy, like nuclear, forgetting about the other problems that are there, nuclear requires a lot of water. And even that can go wrong, Fukushima. So,
The Chernobyl miniseries.
That's right. Yeah. I mean,
All right, well, so I'm looking at the clock. So
Okay.
I want to thank our participants all very much.
Thank you.